Sure. Let's do it.
All right. So we're here for the philosophy of lack with O.G. Rose, Tim Adalin, and Alex Ebert. The philosophy of lack, I think, has a really interesting historical context, namely because when we think about the history of philosophy, we're actually thinking about a discipline of knowledge that has its grounding in the concept of being. And oftentimes, when we think about the history of philosophy in the Western context, we start with a narrative that philosophy began with a man named Parmenides, who theorized the notion of an absolute being, and actually that this theorizing of an absolute being comes as a type of defense or as a type of negation of the void, that the void is a danger, that the void is something that we should avoid, and that being is something that philosophy should align itself with as the true path, and that is so-called the path of wisdom, let's say. So philosophy really has its grounding in being. So when we think about a philosophy of lack, I think we're really turning philosophy inside out. We're turning philosophy from a discipline concerned with the existence of something or the presence of something into philosophy concerned with the existence of the opposite, the existence of nothing or the existence of something missing. And I think that in the history of Western, again, in the Western context, I think that this something missing finds its sort of epistemological location in the emergence of psychoanalysis in the 20th century, namely that subjects submitted themselves to a process of analysis because they were in a type of emotional spiritual sickness, that they felt that there was something missing. Either this constituted a sort of obsessional neuroses, or this constituted a type of hysterical neuroses, but nonetheless that there was something that the subject needed to work through analysis, and namely that there was something missing. Mm-hmm. And in that context, I'd just like to sort of bring it around to feelings I've had in my own personal life, namely this feeling that being, or my being, so that the human being, was missing something, that there was something in my day-to-day life, that there was something in my life world that was just sort of like an inexpressible something missing. I think that throughout the course of time, perhaps the biggest events that sort of made this something missing more obvious than anything else is, for example, in the experience of a romantic breakup, for example, like when you fall in love and it falls apart, there's this feeling of lack. There's this feeling of direct confrontation with the void that you can't get rid of. I even remember, for example, after my first breakup, trying to search online if science had produced a pill that could help me get rid of the feeling of this lack. And obviously stumbling upon the fact that science had nothing to say about this. Then I also sort of had the same feeling happen after sort of catastrophes as it related to my own professional development. You know, you have this big idea of becoming something. And then after you become this something, like, for example, I was motivated throughout my adult life to become a doctoral candidate and then to achieve my doctorate. And then once you achieve it, you have this feeling of this wasn't the thing. It didn't work. That there's still this lack here. It almost brought me to face my day-to-day life that much more intensely than before. Mm-hmm. And then on the course of day-to-day life, there's just this feeling of any of my desires, whether they're related to sexuality, whether they're related to food, the base functions, whenever I reflect on these day-to-day experiences, I find that I'm not eating necessarily because I'm hungry, or I'm not, for example, masturbating obviously because I want to reproduce, the evolutionary functions, but because there's an existential feeling that I'm lacking something, that I'm lacking almost the perfect state of enjoyment, let's say. And images will come in my mind of this perfect state, which then provokes an excitation that I seek to act out or attempt to embody somehow. So this is sort of what I'm trying to get at with the philosophy of lack. And I know each of you in turn have had your own sort of experience in relationship to this feeling of lack. I think it's an important philosophical topic because it brings us to deeply personal issues. And at the same time, it sort of, I think, has not gotten the treatment in professional spaces that it deserves, precisely because our philosophy has its grounding in a notion of being, of something, and also our professional identities are images which pretend to give this illusion of power. So it's an identity which doesn't lack. It's an identity which gives this appearance of fullness. It gives this appearance that I'm strong or I'm powerful or that I know. But lack is the opposite. It's that I don't have power, I don't know, and I'm missing something. and so it's the opposite of what we traditionally think of as professional identities. So I really think a lot is on the line with this conversation. And I know, again, I've had my personal conversations with each of you about this. So why don't I pass this on to you, OG, and let's dive into it.
Excellent. Well, gentlemen, it's wonderful to speak to you. And I can't imagine a better way to spend a Saturday night here in Virginia than speaking about lack. It's a perfect subject. It's wonderful. I'm lacking a party, I suppose. So this is outstanding. No, I think that's exactly right. You've had this focus on being, but then after perhaps Nietzsche with the death of God, which is symbolic of the sort of death of the absolute, it's kind of come roaring back. It's like, hey, guys, y'all never thought about nothing very much, did you? You just sort of assumed that lack wasn't a problem. And now you don't have a choice but to think about it. And actually, arguably, we're facing a lot of consequences because we weren't well trained in thinking about lack and identifying with it and learning how to not fill it with something, but instead to integrate it somehow and to find wholeness in that whole, wholeness, W-H-O-L-E, in the whole, H-O-L-E. It was sign language. Sorry, I took it for 2 years. And in not doing that, we've habituated ourselves to think that the solution is to, well, the problem must be I just need to be myself. Right? When we have that, the problem is I'm not being myself. Well, what's that? You're trying to bring being back into yourself. But if there is, in fact, something about human beings that is fundamentally lacking, that we are not a perfect unity, then if we just be ourselves, we're just going to keep being that thing that has this sort of lack in ourselves. And no matter how hard we try to be ourselves, it's still going to be there. And then we're going to just conclude there's something wrong with us fundamentally, which can have lots of problems because we've never heard of, we don't have trains of thought, like you say, that are habituated to thinking about lacks and thinking how to, Thomas Jochen, a good friend of mine, we did this paper where he said lacks are not nothing. And he talks about Aristotle, how a lack does have form. I guess a way to put it is when I'm doing my taxes, the IRS are not in the room, but they are in the room because I'm thinking about messing up and they not being happy about it. So they're absent, but they actually are there in a very real sense. But the problem is, if we don't have a category of lack and we just say, well, it's nothing, then when you feel those holes, those lacks that you're describing, where you say, well, they're not real, just get over it. They're not real. They're just nothing. So get over it. They're not that's the solution. Just bring in more being. And that's not the solution, but instead learning to integrate nothing. And I think, thinking about theology, you have like Master Eckhart in Christianity, for example, that talks about the negative theology, thinking about God as nothing, because they had a real understanding that if you only ever thought about God positively, it wouldn't be long before you ended up in heresy and idolatry. You'd start conflating capital G God with lowercase g good because you forget that your idea of good is not the same of what is meant when you say God is good. And so they kind of understood that you need to bring in you need to understand that God doesn't exist. You need to understand that God isn't good, because when you use those terms, you're always doing it in your framework. And if you ever forget that, which you inevitably will, If you only ever use positive theology, then you're going to fall into idolatry and heresy. And rather we follow those conclusions or not, it's almost like in philosophy, there hasn't been a negative philosophy per se, and there's have a negative theology, but we haven't had a negative philosophy. And I think it's what you see, you're following the tradition of being, and that set us up for, the psychoanalysis, the psycho problems, and all the problems we have. And that's why it's such an important topic. There are very real stakes.
Wow. Cool. Really good to be here. Man. It's kind of interesting. I enjoy listening to you guys so much, and I enjoy the change in tempo that it even feels like for me to begin expressing in relationship to what I've just heard. And I find that very curious. These ways we differ and yet are oriented around similar phenomena. When I think of lack, I think of, well, trivially, what I'm without. And I think of what I hope I can make of myself and make of life in relationship with others. I think of the desire I feel when I'm most connected to come to a crest of fullness and then face the necessity of letting go and recognize that moment of being, let's say, maximally involved and responsible must give way, and that my holding on to that too long is in some sense a fundamental corruption of what feels to me to be the adaptive, affirming life process. So this relationship between affirming life as a being mode, appreciation, and like I'm right fucking here, I'm in it, and I'm not thinking of me, I'm just in it, I'm in flow. Like how beautiful that is. And all of the stages, aspects of myself, aspects of my relationship that are coming to their own forms of attainment on different time horizons. And this dynamic equilibrium of the parts of myself understood at the levels biology, the social, the psychological, the aspirational, existential, that there's something to coming into alignment across all these levels and more, which is desired, which I desire. And recognizing that inherent in the fulfillment of that sort of alignment is the necessity to effectively give oneself to extinguishment, which isn't a word. Man, that's just a trip. It's just a trip. And when I conceive of that fully or attempt to bite into it, it becomes one of these hyper objects that I cannot box up. It involves this relationship with the transcendent, and nevertheless a life process, and nevertheless the requirement to, from some reflective disposition, understand the structures I'm embedded in, because those very lenses of my understanding are also those which will ultimately be insufficient, even as they are critical to stand on or see through. So these are some initial sort of reflections that come to me. Really pleased to be here, and I get a lot from each one of you guys in speaking to you individually. So I'm very excited about what can emerge in these dialogues.
All right. Wow. Okay. Great to listen to you guys. Okay, so this is what I'm thinking while y'all are talking. Just thinking abstractly for a moment. Anything short of infinity is less than whole. Mm-hmm. Anything short of infinity is less than whole. Nothing, being equilibrium, is the eternalized state. The ideal state is a state in which we need nothing. And so then it would follow that I need nothing. I need nothing. I need it bad. I need to want it and desire it and cultivate a desire for nothing. And I think that in some sense, that's what we're talking about here. If the ideal state needs nothing, then I need nothing. And I think in some sense, that's what we're all after. Now, just to get more physical for a moment, nothing is something. There is no nothing, right? All of this negative space is substance. It might even be consciousness. Maybe one day we'll find out. I believe in nothing. I love nothing. I want to be nothing. Because when I am nothing, when I am it, it ingresses through me. It comes through me. I become a vessel. Because I want nothing. And so nothing wants me. And I create the idea of the individual is the idea of an occluded self. A self that has created a membrane around itself, impermeable, individual. No longer the chalice, no longer having ingresses for nothing to enter, but rather a single circle with a hole in the center of it. That is the state of the individual. And then as individuals, we look for stuff to put into it, to define ourselves further, away from nothing. We fill it with something. We fill it with this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing. And that, then we get to this, mimetic desire and Girardian sort of, shit show. But I do not believe that that is our only capacity. And I might even say I do not believe that that is our natural state. It certainly is not the state of creativity, and it's not the state of flow. The state of flow for me is an emptying of myself, where my contents, all of the things that have stuffed me up, are now contending with the flow. They're contentious. And I must remove them, empty myself, and allow stuff to come back in. And, and then we collect, we reify, and then maybe we disseminate. And then right after disseminating, I want to go back to the ingressing, where I have that flow coming back in. So I think that that's just the way I wanted to start is, I think just with that for now.
Awesome. So like the first thing I want to say is like where I place a philosophy of lack is kind of against both like the naive new ageism of wholeness and like also against kind of like the traditional monotheism of God. Because whenever I run into the traditional monotheism of God or like the new age wholeness, I get like this idea that actually what they're doing is repressing or avoiding the wholeness. Like by wholeness, I mean like the HOLE, like that Daniel started off with. So it's like taking off the W from whole. Like there's a lot in that. Like, and it's like the shift from like the whole with the W is always this image of the perfect connectedness or the perfect unity. And like the whole without that, the W is kind of like, it's my subjectivity almost. It's kind of like how Alex Ebert was describing the circle with the hole in it. Like it's like you, if you pretend you don't have a hole, I think you're just living in relationship to a static image or something like this. So like there's a lot, I think, in this. And I think that's also connected to what OG was saying about that lack is not nothing because lack has a form. So it's like by observing your own lack, the form of your own lack, you get sort of intuition perhaps about the nature of the shape of your own desire. Mm. So like the fact that I started off this talk by emphasizing my collapse in breakups and my collapse in my professional career and then my being brought to the day-to-dayness of like say food and sex is like the shape of my lack. Mm. If you like if I just observe my circle over a 24-hour period, like I like to call it like a Mobius strip. Like if I observe my Mobius strip over a 24-hour cycle, then I can and I pay good, like if I pay as close enough attention as possible to a 24-hour cycle of my being, then I get a sense of the shape of my lack, and so I can start to work with myself, if that makes sense. Like otherwise, I'm just living in relationship to an illusion, which is actually obfuscating my attention of my day-to-day self, of my 24-hour self. Then the question comes, by what methods can I cultivate awareness of my 24-hour rotation, as it were, you know, to get a sense of the shape of myself and to accept the shape of myself, which is huge, right? Because can you accept the totality of the shape of yourself? And in your day-to-day relations, are you interacting with people who could accept that 24-hour, you know, the shape of yourself? I think that this is like, I guess what I'm trying to express is kind of like the starting point of like a Dasein, or a day-to-dayness of the lack that could actually practically help one reach this, what I think Alex Ebert was describing as this nothing as the eternalized state. Because, you know, like that I am nothing, that everything is kind of flowing through me as kind of the ideal state. Because otherwise it's kind of like, I don't know, you're constantly dealing with the friction or the bumpiness of the things you're attaching to, because you can't simply be with yourself as you are, if that makes sense. Like you're constantly contending with like what I would want to call like the residual attachments of your desire to be whole in the naive sense.
Mm, mm, mm.
and that takes a lot of breaking down. That takes a lot of I sort of think about it as like it requires a lot of shedding. It requires a lot of letting go. This is like where, and this is where I'm going to end, but it sort of reminds me of how Tim was describing, you know, this feeling of holding on too long, and that this holding on too longness is a corruption of life. It's preventing me from living. And I guess then where I'm going to end is like it brings you to the necessity of, in order to live, I need to metaphorically die, and I need to build in this shedding process in order to affirm the totality of my being. So I'm gonna pass that on to you, OG.
No, that's excellent. And, you know, it reminds me of what you're saying about holding on and holding on too long. Mr. Ebert down there, that wonderful article he put out on avoidance, on the idea that if you're not, you know, why does what is cancer? It's a cell that refuses to die. And because it refuses to die, it holds on to life too much. It destroys the whole. I think that's a fantastic metaphor. But you see, man, come on, guys. If we got to like hold on and then know when to let go, that's hard. That means we have to be aware and think all the time. We don't want to do that. Come on, just give me a prescription. I'm going to hold on to that and just go, because what you're saying means an actively thinking life, an actively aware life. And now capitalism says I just need to get the right outfit and I'm good to go. I just need to find the right house and I'm good to go. What are you talking about? Regular thinking. I'm supposed to be comfortable, but of course something that's comfortable in this sense dies, and that's not good. You know, there's also something I've been thinking about on these. The infinite. What you're saying there, Ebert, on the idea that we want infinity, and what is it? You know, infinity. You know, infinity needs nothing. That's hot. That's really good. That reminds me of like nothing matters. Well, then nothing matters. That's really nice. And so there's this funny idea, and it's interesting too, because I go back to theology a bit. There really was this understanding that if you did not have a robust concept of nothingness somehow in your theology, you were going to become a heretic. Like if you didn't understand that you are nothing and God is all that exists, or that your understanding of God is nothing compared to the infinite, then you're going to be a heretic, because you're going to be, but people are like, nah, we know God. We have a connection to God. But then, of course, that became a dream for an absolute unity, and then you get all that, and then you have all the religious wars and conflicts and different things, and so it's hard to find. I guess it's hard to find a religious war that was started on negative theology. Really hard to find that. And so, you know, usually it's a positive theology of some kind of special connection of the state or people with God. But it's hard to find those people that are going to go to think they should go kill all the heretics if they have a really robust negative theology. And it's funny because something like that seems to apply to us. And I guess, you know, someone may have heard me saying that philosophy has not done a very good job of nothing. And they'll be like, well, what about the existentialists? What about, you know, Sartre and being and nothingness and all those people? The problem is that it's just kind of nihilism. I think I really prefer the Kyoto school that makes distinctions between nihilism and absolute nothingness. You know, in Sartre, there's a sort of idea that we're nothing. And then, you know, but there's nothing like, well, what now? It's kind of a negative vision. I think we can talk about later how you want to move it also onto a positive aesthetic vision where you're moving forward. So there is talk about nothing, but just because there's talk about nothing, it might just be talk about nothing. So there's been, but also problematically, a lot of the existentialism was in fact a reaction to Nietzsche's declaration per se. And since it had wasted thousands of years, not getting habituated to it, I don't think it had a very good framework for operating. Because what I like to talk about, that, you know, that we've all talked about, is kind of moving something about lack to ontology. And also, I think in a lot of existential thinking, lack is nothing. In fact, these are blurred together. It doesn't have this sort of special role. And that's not quite what we want to do there. Now, of course, to iron that out, you would need different papers. And then lastly, I would like to say, isn't it funny that if you don't accept that there's something lacking, then you can't be WHOLE, whole, because you are something lacking. And ironically, what you end up doing is if you refuse to be WHOE, whole, in that lack, then you live according to holes, H-O-L-E. Things that, once I get that job that you don't have yet, and since you don't have it yet, you can imagine how great it's going to be. Once I get that status, and you can imagine, a hole is something you can fill, and you can fill it with your ideas. And following, as we know from, I guess in the preference with Hegel, this idea that ideas present themselves as kind of part of the absolute, with a sort of A is A, maybe Plato with form. So it's easy to project because there's not that reality there, a certain sort of perfection, and then you go to it, and when you get there and it's not that, you make a new H-O-L-E, then a new H-O-L-E, and a new H-O-L-E, and then it's repetitive. And what we were talking about the other day, Mr. Ebert, when you have that repetitive, what is that? Nothing. And so ironically, the inability to integrate lack is how you end up in nothing. And yet we tend to think that integrating lack is how you end up in nothing. It's this complete paradox. And I do think it's partially a hangover, just like Cadell is saying, on this tradition of meditating on being, to the point at the exclusion of taking seriously lack and not just conflating lack with nothing.
Yeah, really good. Really, really good. So I really like that the notion has come through very strongly, I think, from everyone, that the pursuit of the finite whole is in some sense a source of pathology in a very deep sense. And, at least since my early 20s, when I was writing about this in particular in my own work, I could not really make sense of wholeness. I could make sense of a whole making, which is, I think, what's coming through as a kind of undercurrent here, a processual sense of being in relationship to this process of then becoming, incorporating its lack in some sense. It's whether it's breaking into parts or this lack of alignment. There's something that comes from underneath, which will destabilize that particular image you had, or something like this. But actually, I like to pick up on a point in particular as well that you raised, Daniel, about this notion of like religious wars, and that these hadn't been started on a philosophy of lack or something like this. Phrased it a lot better than this, but there was this, there was very much a belief in something, right, that was worth fighting for. And and I'm no scholar really of just about anything, and I'm certainly no scholar of Eastern philosophy, but I have some understanding here and there, and to the extent there's something named that's a real domain and dynamic to live and experience, perhaps there's more understanding than I have scholarship. There is this concept of the hungry ghosts, right, in Buddhism, and this notion of suffering that is, foundational to Buddhism, at least as I grok it, has denotes at the very least this desire to fill that cannot be filled, something unsatiable, and that coming into a sort of right relationship with that is, let's say, something that's on the path. And to add something else in, there's I find the quote, which I can't remember, but the mangled version of it is that the Buddha was really good at, creating other Buddhists, but maybe not so fantastic at helping to realize other Buddhas. And so I'm sure actually he probably was amazing. It's very hard, but I guess. But there's something very interesting in that, because even if we were to just say, stepping away from Buddhism, to hypothesize some set of, guidelines maybe would be the best case, but some philosophy of lack, right, that could really help guide people, that there were practices to do, that we came to know each other and related as something cohesive for a certain period of time, about this capacity, let's say, to engage in a sort of death practice, to renew ourselves, to let go appropriately, that the manner by which that then shared identity, or perhaps performed set of values we'd come to associate with this process of giving up, right? It can, ultimately, I'm interested in in the movement in something, I want to step back again, something broadly in that direction, but certainly wary of the fact that, you know, I forget which author spoke about this, but I believe that the Nazis did Himmler liked, was it bloody him? He liked slipping, you know, these little handbooks of certain aspects of Buddhist philosophy into some of the SS and different soldiers who had to commit obviously very dehumanizing acts. The idea being, I suppose, that there's a capacity to cultivate a phenomenology that is, I would say, a bastardized version of some of these philosophies, but a certain capacity to really let go and kind of just accept the nature of just what is and detach from it, maybe dissociate. This is an interesting relationship between dissociation and really letting go fully, which I think is quite fascinating. And the point ultimately I'm trying to gesture at is something like mistaking even the practice, even mistaking one's conception of the practice, mistaking one's, I suppose, mimetic copying of what seems to be the path or the way as that which is in some sense a kind of sleeping, ready to pounce, maybe not the right metaphor, way in which, you know, this structure can be, this ideal, these values can be destabilized. Something in there with your help to articulate further over the course of this or other conversations, I think is quite interesting, because it ultimately points, I think, and where I'd love to go is to bite into what feels like and what can look like a kind of context ultimately for broader scale, like dignifying ethical participation in the kinds of death practices that we're speaking. A lot of people are speaking about this. I'm no one to champion this. There's a lot of people all over the place kind of lighting up about some of these notions, and I think it's very important, but I think it's also extremely treacherous, so it's very fascinating.
Yeah, it's definitely treacherous. I'm going to pick up on what some of you guys said in a second. I'll preface it. Before I go on stage, I have a hack for achieving immortality, which I need before I go on stage, and that is to become extremely anxious. As anxious as I can possibly become. Uh-oh, we lost Cadell.
Well, he's not nothing. He's just a lack. Okay, he's a form. He's a prey. He's still existing in some way. So what were you saying on anxiety, Mr. Ebert?
So before going on stage, in order to, I discovered a hack to cultivate wholeness, to cultivate nothing, actually. And there's a combination of two things, actually. There's one exercise where you literally cross your eyes and focus on negative space, and you are what you become. So you are what you focus on, and you focus on nothing, literally with your eyes, and you just think about the space between things, and you start to become that space. And then the other is this sort of more radical proposition, which Tim is alluding to, can be treacherous, which is really diving into the mess, exponentializing it intentionally, to arrive at the absurdity of it. And it's actually, you know, Osho sort of made that meditation famous. And I've used it, especially back when I had a lot of suicidal ideation. And it's difficult to recommend intentionally becoming, there you are, intentionally becoming more sad or more anxious than you already are. But there is a practice there that actually really works. And by multiplying the effect of my own anxiety before I go on stage to the point of absurdity, a removal occurs where suddenly I'm able to witness myself in the anxious state. And I think there's something there. So I'll just pin that for a second. And I just want to talk about something I'm just sort of calling I'm sure someone else has called it because it sounds vaguely familiar, but mortal return as equilibrium. And I just want to bring up waveforms and just imagine a music file. We've all seen music files if you've played SoundCloud or anything. And you see these peaks and valleys going across an equilibrium. And so you have these spikes on either side of zero, death, or the void, let's say, nothing, no sound. But you have these disruptions of nothing. And let's say for a moment that that nothingness is here. And that what we're doing is going from equilibrium to something, to nothing, to something, to nothing, to something. So while you guys were speaking, I just did an experiment with myself. Because I can whip myself into such a neurotic state on command, I did that while you guys were speaking. And then I did an experiment where I have the void here, and it's not WHOLE, it's just a hole, and it feels bad. It's the void. And then I have, let's say, God up here. And I just went, God, me. God, me. Wholeness, void. Wholeness, void. Breathe in, wholeness, breathe out, void. Breathe in, wholeness. And I just was experimenting with what it would be like to experience myself intentionally as the waveform, where I have my equilibrium at center, and then I'm oscillating. And each time I pass through equilibrium or death, or the void, rather, nothing, the eternalized state, which is here, each time I pass through it, I'm disrupting it and creating, accessing wholeness, accessing everything in this way. And just as a practice, just now while listening to you guys, breathing in everything, out me and the void. And doing that over and over again, eventually those two things, me and God, me and God, me and God, me and the universe, me and the universe, eventually they started to associate. They were no longer disparate states, but they started to conglomerate. And a union was beginning to occur just as it was my turn. So anyway, I think that there is something to that visual of the waveform and crossing equilibrium or crossing nothing, crossing the void. And that if we can think of ourselves as oscillations and intentionally pass through our nothingness to come back into something like wholeness, which is the way that I access wholeness before I go on stage. So anyway, to just bring that all together, I think there could be practices developed that would be rather simple, that could pass us through from void to wholeness, breath in, breath out, breath in, and eventually those disparate states start to sort of, associate.
All right, guys. I'm obviously am I coming through?
Yes, we can hear you. Absolutely.
All right. Yeah. Okay. My connection's presenting some trouble, but
don't worry about it.
I missed a lot of what Alex said, unfortunately, but I'll try and respond as best as I can or contribute as best as I can to what's been said. I guess I would start by saying that it's interesting that positive theology leads to war where negative theology has not led to war. I'm not an expert on that topic either, but there's this notion I was playing with before going live here that when we start off with a metaphysics of being, I think what we tend to do is build up that being into the perfect being.
Yes.
And then we try to achieve an end which justifies the means to that end.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the ends justify the means. So basically, the perfect being becomes something that would justify many atrocious acts.
Right.
You know, whether that's war, whether that's, you know, communism, whether that's it could be a certain relationship, it could be buying something one really wants as building up a perfect being. So you justify, for example, working a job you hate because you're justifying that based on the perfect being that you're going to attain, whether that's a house, whether that's a spouse, whether that's whatever it is, but you're building up a perfect being. And so in some sense, that's what I take to be this fault of positive theology, which paradoxically, the negative theology, there's no war because you're going to war within oneself.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to war at the base with this fact that I exist on the condition that the perfect being doesn't exist. Like that's the very condition of possibility for me.
Right.
So I would just situate that as sort of like how I maybe relate to theological questions or how I relate to theological day-to-dayness. And it's very difficult to do. It takes a lot of like, no matter how much you understand it abstractly, I find there's still, like, you know, the what I would call the struggle with, you know, doing nothing in the evening. You know, like I'm with myself in the evening. And what am I doing with myself in the evening? Like, that to me is theology. Like, that's my theology. Is like I'm with myself in the evening, and I could fill in the void of myself with various historical habits that I've accumulated through a need for avoiding boredom, through a need for achieving some excitation, through not wanting to simply sit with myself and observe what thoughts are coming, what feelings are attached to those thoughts. Like, I really think that there's so much to be found in the man or woman who can see the importance of thinking about how I spend my evening, or how I go to sleep, or what did I dream about last night? You know, like, this is, again, bringing it back to, like, sort of observing the Mobius loop of my 24-hour self. But, like, this is, like, and I guess that's sort of connected to what Tim was bringing up about this realm of the hungry ghosts and Buddhism, is that I guess I feel like our society is really structured on hungry ghosts. And that makes trust very impossible. It makes, like, long-term relationships difficult. It makes sort of it just makes life based on these insubstantial illusions. And at the same time, building out a type of Buddhist culture, so to speak, has many pitfalls and many hurdles, because you can sort of even turn the idea of Buddhism into its own hungry ghost. Like, you can turn it into its own idea. Like, it's very hard to, like, what I say, it's very hard to teach silence, or it's very hard to teach quietness. because it's paradoxical, like what we're doing right now is speech. Like if we're teaching, we teach through speech. And so like one of the things I've learned in the last few weeks is to teach with, or at least, and this is something I'm really a novice at, to be honest, but it's to teach through my being as opposed to teaching through my speech, how I am as a being. And my best mentor in this process has been a cat. Because my relationship with a cat, because the cat doesn't care about what I say. In fact, the cat actively avoids what I say. If I try to speak to the cat, it will avoid me. But if my being is in such a way, then the cat will come to me. And I can sort of gauge by my being how I'm doing in this process, like how the cat sort of reacts to me in this process is very strange. Mm-hmm. It's like I want to like juxtapose it with something strange, which is like both like pickup artistry and religious proselytizing. That in both pickup artistry and religious proselytizing, there's this type of aggressive energy that's trying to get something. And I think like what I'm trying to think of is the opposite of that, where it's kind of like I'm not saying anything or I'm not actively trying to get anything, but my very being calls forth the thing. Like my very mode of being speaks the thing. And I don't have to speak the thing directly. Like this is, I think, the crucial thing before I pass it on. And maybe this is connected in part to what Alex was talking about building day-to-day practices and getting to like this notion of what are the day-to-day practices. But like I don't have to speak the thing directly. And in fact, when I do speak the thing directly, I'm just going to kill it anyway. But like, it's that because I have the thing in my being, I can still speak, but it's going to be about everything except that. Like, it's going to be constantly around that, or I hope I'm making sense, but I pass this on to you, Daniel.
Well, now that you mentioned cats, I'm thinking about Murakami novels, Kafka on the Shore, and I'm thinking about the barn cats my kids love. So very nice. What was it? I guess it was like Muhammad said he'd rather like cut his sleeve off before disturbing a cat that's asleep. So, you know, cats are important. A few things. One, as soon as you say something, and then it's out in the world, you go, wait, no, it's gone. Oh, gosh. So, we're talking about negative theology because someone may come back. It's like, hey, guy. What about that Zizek quote where he's talking about the Buddhists, how they're imagining their hand doesn't exist as they stab someone and therefore it can enable them? But I'd already said, it's like, But you see, it's very important when I talk about the negative theology. It's very tied with mystical tradition. And the key is a mystical tradition. Nothingness does not become its own absolute unity. And that, how we're talking about the problem of absolute unity? Mysticism creates a kind of bothness where you have to operate on this idea that God exists, but he doesn't exist in this kind of weird space. God exists, but he's not real. You see, the problem is that you can get, I think this is what my critique of a lot of existentialism is that it feels like nothingness becomes its own unity, and lack is distinct from nothingness, although it's very difficult to maintain the language and overlay it perfectly as we have these conversations because they're all similes. But lacks are both, as Mr. Joachim was saying, as an Aristotle, and I'm going to keep pressuring him to write that paper, is that a lack is a absence that has form. And it reminds me also of your wonderful presentation, Cadell, on mind that everyone should go. And great, well done on the paper that was published. And so you see, if we create a religion that is nothing, that has a unified nothing, you can get violence out of it. And also, if you have an absolute being that is unified, you can get violence out of it. What seems to be interesting is it's difficult to find those mystics, right, that are engaging in a lot of war. Now, also, there's that Oxford University Press book that says the myth of religious war that then claims, there's no such thing as religious wars. So this is the part where you have a conversation and 5,000 people in the comments are like, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this? Did you hear about this? But generally speaking, it's when you have this bothness that you're operating in, this sort of tension, the act of, say, the existentialist could leave you, it's like Camus says that, the ultimate question is suicide. Well, in a sense, suicide would be trying to unify yourself in a kind of absolute nothing. You're escaping the tension, right? But then fundamentalism would be a new kind of AA, where you're escaping the tension and you're existing in those, just saying, well, this is the truth, these are the givens, and this is how it is. And one of the problems you do get with religion is a possibility of getting these fundamental givens. That creates, what I think it creates is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talked about, but that's a different topic. So it's finding that between space that I think the word lack is so useful, and what exactly that means we can go into. But then what's also, when you're talking about the wonderful practices, Alex, I really love that, the waif, God, nothing. God, whole. God, nothing. That's really great. It reminds me, too, that religions were really good at paradoxical practices. Like, Jesus saying, to live, you have to die. Or, you have some of, this is the saint that was with the birds all the time. I cannot believe I forgot this one. Everyone loves that guy. Yeah. Who was it? I heard the name. Putting you on the spot.
No, the Italian.
It goes with an A. Oh my gosh, it's awful. But there's this idea that you find wealth in poverty. There's this idea that when you die, you find life, these kind of paradoxical practices. And it's kind of like Chesterton's fence, where he talks about if you come on the woods and you find a fence and you don't know what it's there for, the temptation is to kind of throw it out. But, maybe if you don't know what it's there for, you might want to be careful before you remove it, because there might be some functions that it had you didn't understand. I think something that as religion wanes that we may not appreciate is those paradoxical practices that it brought with us that could help people kind of have this between space of, being in Christianity, being a sinner, or, trying to move towards sainthood, these kind of paradoxical practices that today we need to make new paradoxical practices. But sometimes, because I suppose of the long history of philosophy focused on being, or capitalism that focuses on wholeness, and you can be whole if you just fulfill your desires and all those different things, we see no need to develop those paradoxical practices, like Mr. Ebert is talking about. So I think it is useful, and Osho talks about that. You in the Red Book you shared, like these kind of paradoxical practices that we need to recreate, that I think sometimes we don't really even realize we need, because we don't even realize that religions, and and then of course you can go into each individual religion and talk and blah blah blah. I understand I'm using Christianity as a kind of reference point, but they offer paradoxical practices that were very, very useful, that we may not appreciate, that we need to bring back. So I wrote a note down on the one you were doing, Ebert. I really like that, on breathing and the idea of getting into a frenzy before going on stage. I'm going to use that with my kids. Before I go play with them, I'm going to cross my eyes. David Hume would love that, because he makes an example of the eye, and I'm going to go play with them in the yard. It's going to be great.
You're referring to St. Francis, right?
Yes. Yes. Thank you. I was going to be something. I was going to wake up at midnight in a hot sweat. Now I don't have to wake up at midnight to remember the name. Good job.
I have to go to the restroom. I'll be right back. You're allowed. Right here.
Yeah. So I understand that a hope for this live stream and dialogue in general is to see about grounding some of the philosophy in the day-to-day in some sense, and I like, and that's definitely something that's coming through here, both with kids and stage practice and cats, and as well, Cadell, as you're looking towards this period of time in the evening. That's something I relate to. I think that's very powerful, and I imagine that some of those listening will resonate strongly with that as well. It can be a lonely time, not for everyone, of course, depends who you live with, maybe. Can be a lonely time. This sense of often not having the energy to really create what you might like, or to produce what you might like. Not always. I mean, I generally stay up pretty late, and often it's a wonderful creative time. But often there's a sense of me looking to fill something, as you're talking about, Cadell, and it really not being the right state of mind for me to be looking to do that in. But, you know, it's those times when I have more or less fulfilled myself during the day that make it much easier to accept being with not all that much in the evening, or just accepting that. And that as well, I think, can ground us in the conditions we experience in our current societies. It often feels, you know, and just as a nod towards religious war and what have you, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me to consider any war without, you know, considerations of the conditions of scarcity as well in the land, and all manner of economics, geopolitics, it's like evolution, you know, all of this stuff. As I find myself distracted here by some pop-ups on my screen, it's and that's the thing, you know, it's accepting the silence, like really allowing it and recognizing that as part of the process of interaction, something that's missing a lot from many online discourses because of the medium. You know, it feels like we've got to fill the space with speech. It feels like we have to fill our evenings with productivity if we haven't achieved enough. But what if we haven't managed a life where that productivity can actually be fulfilling? And so we're left with actually the kind of hole that we need to fill. We need to fill it with something more nutritious. We haven't eaten well enough, you know? In that sense, we've got to fill the bloody hole so that we can pass through some nutrition out the other hole. So there's a certain, it's an interesting one, you know. We have stories of, you know, the Eckhart Tolle dropping out, you know, of his ordinary life and spending a couple years on a bench. And we can go that way of, in that sense, exiting. There's a big risk with that. And in some sense, that's a heroic journey. And but for many people, I think it's worth considering that position also from a certain kind of privilege, or at least the affordance of a position of less responsibility in one's life. I'm not saying it would be unethical necessarily to drop even loving attachments. You know, I'm not seeking to moralize, but some of what seems to be the case, and part of the condition, I think, for the struggle that we are in civilization wide, is that for all of the, you know, the language of self-terminating, you know, that Daniel Schmachtenberger speaks about comes to me here. That may be a little too harsh, but for all of the toxic patterns we find ourselves involved in, there is also, in most cases, and depending on how mystically we want to speak, all cases, a through line of love and value and worth and something deeply worthwhile. Say like the cat you're taking care of, or the family or the friends you have. And there are things worth, in some sense, and I'm being a little equivocal here when I say this, and that's part of the challenge with these discussions, I suppose. There's something worth holding on to. And the holding on to that might preclude us, the desire to hold on to that might preclude us from actually dropping those other more toxic habits and distinguishing what the relationships between those things. I think that's where a lot of this work is in. And so finding space, if one can, in the evening or whenever, to sit with the silence, find one's own way of coming into clarity, you know, relationships with others, interaction, a certain aspiration to artfulness in communication, a deep listening, writing, dance, music, a whole bunch of things. But, you know, it's a process.
I was just talking to my dad. He's had a couple close calls with death recently. And he had another close call that turned out not to be a close call. And we were talking about mortality. And he said, you know, I'm all right. I'm all right facing my death. You know, I got all right when I was in the hospital for a month and nobody came to see me. That's not totally true. But for the most part, he was dead alone in a white room. I went and visited him once. I don't live in Colorado. I made a thing of it. It was his birthday. But he was in a room for a month alone. Nothing. No music. Nothing. He had a window with blinds and that was it. And he said that that month robbed him in the most positive way of... It acquainted him with nothing. It acquainted him with nothing. And, you know, I think Tim's point is necessary, especially to the extent that anyone's watching this and confused, that we are speaking about an interior as opposed to food and water, and that obviously contemplating these things, an interior nothing, would come after acquiring your basics. So just in case anybody out there is like, these privileged 4 white dudes, blah, 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 just to acknowledge that for everybody watching.
I'm red, not white. You guys might be. I'm just joking.
I'm white.
Oh, red. Oh,
I'm just joking.
No, I'm white. I mean, I'm wearing a tie. That's pretty.
Yeah, we can all see you're white, Daniel. Don't worry about that.
You can see.
No. Oh, and I also want to qualify that there is no biological basis for race. So
there you go.
Throw that out there. Okay. So anyway, boy. Okay. I guess I'm a little drawn to 2 things, but one especially. Just maybe note or open it up for discussion. Maybe it's relevant. Where did this lack begin? And initially, in the immediate sense, I think that, well, speaking for myself, when I feel the lack, it is contextual and largely intersubjectively mediated, where I'm thinking of lack in terms of my proportion to someone else's, my having to someone else's, or even simply in my position, my dreams, the things I wanted to accomplish. Where am I in that schema? How far have I come? How far do I have to go, et cetera, et cetera. The journey of life, the hero's journey that I want to project of myself into the world, not necessarily items I want to acquire, but rather things I want to be, things I want to become. That path is, I think, largely intersubjectively driven. Now, at the same time, when we start talking about the late evening, which I think is a brilliant, this should be the name of a book, because that is the time when the loneliness creeps in the interior, non-intersubjective way. And likely, that is where this all started. And the avoidance of the void being suddenly possible with this sort of like accumulation of attentional prospects. I can put my attention here, I can do this, I can do that. And we see kids and we see ourselves divert ourselves from the void by, making ourselves busy. So that likely is where that started, but I guess I'll leave that part there, because I think that I think that what that signifies to me is that this late evening, this evening prospect of being alone in the evening as the sun is coming down, which is inherently existential, the end of the day, the death of the day. I used to cry, by the way, every time the sun set for about 2 years. I would have like an existential, poetic crisis, but it was beautiful, but it was a lot. And, but it was beautiful. It was poetry. The very premise, I think this is worth talking about too. The very premise of poetry, in my view, is transience. Something is elevated from, oh, that's cool, to wow, awe, because it will no longer last. And there's an inherent beauty to be found. Well, I would say poetry exists purely because of transience and purely because of imminent lack. And then to move on, and that really helps me, by the way, to get really into appreciation. I think appreciation is a key of some sort. And I think that, you know, if we were all eternalized beings, I don't necessarily know where appreciation would even fit into the mix. Mm-hmm. So, and then lastly, if I understand the hungry ghost on any level, based on what you guys said, and Cadell, you brought up trust. I know I'm bringing up too many points here, but I do want to just touch on this. So Cadell, you said it makes wanting to be whole, wanting to establish certainty, essentially, makes trust difficult in relationships. Isn't that ironic? Because the whole construct of trust in society, in modern life today, is based on certainty and, importantly, redundancy. This will be the same thing today as it will tomorrow. Therefore, I can trust it. The utter inverse of a state of lack, in which I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow because I'm simply existing now. And our whole trust apparatus is based on this redundancy as an eternalizing sort of effect, which is, of course, self-terminating and deadening spiritually and personally. Because what we turn into, of course, the other thing that persists from this day to that day are brands. And we're encouraged, I know this is something that everybody already understands, but we're encouraged to be brands. Find yourself, be yourself, express yourself. And then once you find yourself, don't deviate from yourself, which is what my whole presentation on Cool was. I had found a version of myself, so I thought. Then I changed, and I got, you know, I got scapegoated for it because it disrupted the whole trust apparatus. And anyway, yeah, some thoughts.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. I guess where the point I want to start with is I think it's interesting that OG brought up that there is at the same time the risk of the absolute being. There's also the risk of the absolute nothingness, because the desiring unity with the absolute nothingness is suicide. And in some sense, Camus is a good example of this trap. You know, maybe we could have a juxtapose here, Parmenides and Camus. And the idea that in existentialism, you actually wind up with this type of ridiculous nihilism where you're, you know, like the Camus quote, I think, is, should I have a cup of coffee or should I kill myself? You know, like it's just this absurd existentialism, which, I mean, appeals to a certain part of us, but also is not a wise or sustainable philosophy. So, you know, I guess like where a lot of this philosophy gets messed up, I think, is in a very simple Hegelian point, which is that becoming exists in between something and nothing.
Yes.
So you can't have an absolute something or an absolute nothing. You have a something and a nothing, and you kind of have to like the something would be that I understand the body in which I appear and the society in which I appear. And the nothing would be that I understand that I'm going to die. And I understand that my time is limited and I'm a finite mortal. And I can become within these constraints of something and nothing. Like, to put it very simply, but I think clearly. And I think that we can have philosophy that tries to enshrine an absolute being, which would be like the perfect body and the perfect society that exists forever. And then you could have the absolute nothing, which is, well, because the absolute being is impossible, why don't I just fucking kill myself then? You know, so there's some in between, and this is, I think, where the Chesterton's fences come in. You know, like the daily practices, the religious practices which we've lost because probably we didn't have wise religious leaders who actually were practicing.
Right.
You know, it's not so much the denomination of religion that's important, so much as, I would say, wise men and women who are actually practicing. You know, like, and that, I think, has to be ground in the alone with the alone, which is that when you're alone with yourself in the evening, like, are you actually practicing? Like, you know, it's you know, it's really a different thing. Like, I think, like, that's, again, like, where I would start, like, my sort of encounter with theological questions is in the alone with the alone after existential catastrophe of my illusions have caved in on themselves. I have to confront myself very deeply. And then I think that brings us to something else that both Tim and Alex brought up that I think unifies some of what they were saying, at least, which is both kind of like, on the one hand, the privilege of confronting the void. Like, well, I think maybe both Tim and Alex brought up this privilege of confronting the void, which I think is worth dwelling on a little bit. And in order to sort of go to the depth of what this privilege is and some of, like, the pitfalls of confronting this privilege, I would like to give, like, my critique of the Buddha story, which is that in order for the Buddha to become a Buddha, he had to first be a king or a prince. Like, he lived in royalty. Like, a homeless person, someone who was born into poverty, doesn't become a Buddha. And what that means is, the paradox of that is, and maybe it's also the paradox of Buddhism as a social historical phenomenon, which is, in order to achieve enlightenment in some sense, you do have to go through the illusion of having wealth. You do have to go through the illusion of having enough food, of sleeping with women or men, or like living in and trying to, you know, you have to have your heart broken. You have to have fought for the career, had the career, tried to strive for the dream and have it fail. Like, you have to go through that, which is the building up of a certain sense of self, a certain sense of ego, in order to lose it, in order to know what the void is deeply. So, like, to me, if I was the mentor for an 18-year-old, I wouldn't tell them, you know, because I had my heart broken and because I realized going for a doctorate was an illusion, I wouldn't say, therefore, don't do it. I would say, do it. Fall in love, you know, start the band, go to school, do whatever it is that your heart, set your heart on fire. Knowing, in part, that it might all collapse and will likely collapse, since we're all going to die, so it's going to collapse. So somehow it's going to collapse. How it will collapse, you don't know. But that whole process is part of becoming someone like an Eckhart Tolle or an Osho or a Krishnamurti or an actual wise, enlightened individual. The question is, what is the historicity of your collapse, so to speak? But I think that's like where I take that. So like, for example, how I started this conversation is I was talking about how I've had my heart broken and I've had my illusions collapse in on themselves in a certain historical form. Now, probably you have had a different story, but it might have some similarities, but it'll have a different historicity to it. But what's at stake here is a type of ahistorical and atemporal confrontation with lack, which leads to potential for enlightenment. And I think that as being, like, we're all pretty much of the same age, I would say, or in the same sort of, you know, developmental zone. But that what are the practices for people in our developmental zone that help them transition into a wise adulthood? And what, before I pass it on, I would say that a wise state, a matured state of adulthood is very rare, and most don't end up embodying it because there is no other to teach it.
Right.
Oftentimes. Certainly not in our society. In our society, we see images of people trying to maintain a type of juvenile youth into eternity. Like to like, you know, the most ridiculous example for a lot of women is trying to look like a 20-year-old girl when you're 80. You know, or for the guy, you know, to like look like Arnold Schwarzenegger forever. Or something like that, you know, like to give it the most ridiculous examples, you know, like, but I'll just pass that on to you, OG.
No, excellent. You gentlemen are fantastic. This is lovely. And, you know, to what Alex is saying, you know, if life didn't end, life wouldn't be precious, right? But here's the problem. If life ends, that means there's scarcity. And what tends to cause so many problems and conflicts and scarcity? So the very mechanism that can contribute to making things precious can also turn to us looking at it as scarce, which then can contribute to neurosis or conflict or different things. So how do we learn to live with things that are limited and see preciousness in that limitation as opposed to scarcity? Now, of course, you also have this dilemma on capitalism, like you're saying. You know, if you look at Marx is interesting because, you know, when you read The Capital, he's not saying, he talks about capitalism as having a necessary role, right? There's kind of like, he's not saying there shouldn't have been, you have to go through capitalism to get to communism, socialism, you know, all these different terms. But he's not saying it was therefore bad, you know. And the problem is, it's almost like, I guess, for what Marx may say, just similar to what you're saying, Mr. Ebert, about the cancer cell, the problem is capitalism didn't know when to change, when to die, and therefore became cancerous. And then turned into corporatism or something like that. It's hard to even find conservatives who are pro-free markets who aren't critical of the current state of affairs, which is quite interesting. But similarly, sometimes when we talk about first world problems versus second world problems and third world problems, they're kind of like on a scale of severity as opposed to being on a continuum. So it's almost like what we do now is we have to be careful before we start acting like first world problems, which are more of the neurosis or these different things that we're describing. They're real problems. People suffer because of them. The lacks are not nothing. And you see, if you go, well, those are first world problems, man, don't worry about it. And therefore you're tempted to say they're nothing, bring in more being per se, and that's no good. But because it has to be on a continuum, like once you solve the economic problem, well, now you have the mental problem. And the person who's dealing with mental problems, just telling, I mean, I've seen it, just telling them, well, at least you have a house, you know, at least you have food. That's not going to solve their neuroses. Now, at the same time, there is something to be said about gratitude. It's this space that you have to operate. It's, you know, you don't want to be the butterfly that's looking down at the caterpillar and say, well, at least you can walk, and you don't want to be the caterpillar looking up at the butterfly and say, don't complain to me about wind, man. That's wing problems or something, right? You know, it's all on the same continuum. And lastly, what I find really interesting is on this question of where does the lack come from? I did a lot of work in Hinduism, and there's this old debate between these two books, these two thinkers, Louis Dumont, who wrote a book called Homo Herogoctosis, and Dirk, who did Caste of the Mind. And, you know, Dumont wants to argue that the caste system came into existence because there's something in human nature that wants to create hierarchy. And, you know, Dirk comes along and he says, no, man, it's the British. You know, the British did it. They created the caste system to control, because then they could get the Brahmin and they could control the Brahmin class and then control everything. And, you know, the whole thesis I did is like, well, maybe it's a mixture of some kind. Isn't that's always the good move, right? Where you mix them and you're like above the fray because you mix them and everyone gives you claps or whatever. But no, seriously, it's like there is something about the human psyche that likes order. And then it's easy for, say, the British to come in and turn that into a hierarchy that they control. So likewise, I do wonder, maybe it's something where we're stuck in a human brain that really likes stability and repetition, but we exist in a world that won't let us be stable and comfort all the time. So there's a disconnect, and that creates a lack. And then capitalism comes along and says, nah, man, I'll tell you what's going to solve it. It's going to be YouTube videos that we're making now. Oh, no. It's going to be like a new house or something. So it might be interesting to do sort of a Dumont-Dirk debate in regard to what is it in human nature. I mean, as y'all all know, I want to argue that ontologically we're AB, not AA, and we don't want to make a new AA out of being or a new AA out of being, nothing. We want to exist in this tension, et cetera, so that you don't fall, because there's a ditch on either side of the road and you don't want to fall on one or the other. And that's the other thing. It seems like so often the name of the game is this kind of transition, this kind of knowing when to switch, when to pin. It's like, all right, the life drive, you wouldn't get to a successful socioeconomic order, like let's say in the West, generally speaking. Of course, there's racial, problems and different things, but you wouldn't get there if you didn't have a life drive at all. The life drive gets you to the place where you create a middle class. But then when you create the middle class, if you hold on to that life drive too much, it becomes, just like you talked about, Mr. Ebert, a death drive. So there has to be a transition phase. But this is really hard, because all your evidence shows you that you should keep doing what you've done so far, because look where it's gotten you. If you're just empirical, like, look, we made like a really rich society. So you have to kind of fly in the face of, what your economic data is showing you, and kind of go, no, we have to, it's kind of like so much, if you really didn't care about extending life expectancy, if you didn't really want to make technology that got rid of sickness because you're like, well, we don't want to hold too much onto life, then, we'd all be dying at 40. So there's a good degree of the life drive to extend life expectancy. Maybe people would argue with that. But then there's this weird thing where it's like too much. And then you get this like living forever, maybe some of the transhumanist movement or different things that can seem problematic. I'm not an expert in that field, so I'll be careful, where we've got to make these transitions, these almost flip moments, that if we don't do it and our brain doesn't want to do it, and everything that we've observed up to that point in history suggests we shouldn't do it, but if we don't do it, we turn into these sort of neuroses. We get into all these different problems. And that might be a role of philosophy, right? I mean, if you don't have any empirical data so much through history to show you that this has occurred, you have to have the abstract reasoning to just be aware of your phenomenological condition to such a point that there would be reason to think you need to have a transition. But if you've kind of thrown out abstract thinking, generally speaking, in your colleges, and you don't think it matters and just be practical or whatever, then that may contribute to the inability to make that transition.
Damn, really good. So much good stuff there, OG, and Cadell. Yeah, Alex too. Alex, there's one thread that you were exploring, which I need to go and listen back to again. There was such a beautiful moment there that I wanted to speak to, and maybe it will come through. I can't put my finger on it right now. Just wanted to name something I cannot name in some sense that I really appreciated. But I'm going to try and see if I can weave together some of these threads, kind of working backwards. I'm hearing an affirmation of the importance of this dialectical tension between the life drive and the death drive. I'm hearing also the point made, which I think is which is related to that, of course, which is an interesting one. This notion of human beings desiring order, and in some sense being embedded in a world which will always upend those plans. And it brought to mind also, just to, I think, further drive the point of challenge in Dostoevsky makes when sort of fantasizing about a utopia or something like this, that as soon as it was attained, you'd have those people immediately look to break those boundaries and create a little bit of chaos, so it'd be interesting. And then I'm also hearing something which I also wish to deeply affirm. I think it's a profoundly, I've currently got this loaded as a profoundly important ethical point, ethical stance, and it's a little tangential, but I was also hearing the absolute importance of not judging another's suffering, of not judging another's lack. It's a deeply de-dignifying and undignifying thing to do, and an incredibly narcissistic thing to do. Like, all of a sudden, my suffering, hey, like, honestly, shut up with your bollocks, hey, I'm suffering here, like, my God, or there's something so dangerous about that path. But I want to also jump back to something Cadell was raising. This I suppose it's a through line of this whole discussion. How to live before letting go, the importance of living before letting go, in terms of counseling another on their developmental arc through life. Like, here are my failings. Don't fucking have a relationship. Yeah, don't pursue that object of your desire. Just stay fucking in the basement, man. Like, what an awful, like. And yet, here's something, because what I'm trying to do with this is I'm trying to really challenge us, because it seems like there are some things we just ought not do. It seems that way, right? And let me go at this by giving an example. It's like, I really hope I don't need to learn that sort of jumping off a cliff, or like not looking as I sprint towards the edge of a cliff for a finish line that's a meter away, is like like a good thing to do, or something like this, or like, will I actually break and die if I jump off this cliff? I should be able to learn this thing, right? We can't teach each other the various ways we can fall off the path, metaphorically, drastically. Then we're not doing any form of worthwhile intergenerational knowledge transmission. Like, but it's the most basic point in the world. But it's kind of remarkable now as we enter this age of again, Daniel Schmachtenberger term, everybody talks about it, but there's exponential technology, and in my way of thinking, just more and more power in smaller and smaller boxes. There's only going to be more big red buttons that, if we touch them, will fuck us up, right? That's interesting. That there's something about, and this gets to some of like the real animalistic tension that we as human beings are facing, because we are so fragile. We have built so many complicated structures. The real of the complexity of cosmos is so ready and willing to just obliterate anything we could name as an object of care in some sense. And so hence the criticality only more of this cultivation of a relationship with the transcendent. But I want to hold these things then in tension, because the necessity of the death practice, of the cultivation of the relationship with lack, and at the same time, I don't know quite how to say on the other side of it. Maybe I've spoken enough to the tension there, but it's something like I guess, just in some sense, it's the conservatism and the progressivism on just another axis. It's like, we can't just have every motherfucker just going to the boundary and just playing with every fucking thing, because that is not sustainable, but we nevertheless need to go there, and we can only become ultimately captured by those who go across the boundary, find something really fucking interesting. We want to talk about mimetic desire. We just want to, whatever it is that attracts people to like that you know, that one who's gone over the edge and come back and seems to understand and embody the fulfillment and energy of that heroic journey, man. And because people don't want to go there themselves, they'll just follow that. And so it's like we have to go, we have to cultivate the development, and yet and it ties up a little bit with the point about the Bard Absolute, which we haven't presenced. What I'm trying to get to is that there's only a critical rate, there's like a coming to criticality of an ethical dimension to life that has been there always, because we have the capacity to take life and the capacity to hurt others and to inflict unnecessary suffering. But there's something about the scale of it and the fragility of ourselves in relationship to technology and our interconnectedness, to say nothing of the psychodynamic kind of space of the psychedelic infused uncertain territory of like being in novelty together in this liminal state of becoming inside a kind of Bard Absolute type dynamic, these most, in some sense, sacred of dimensions. My God. Yeah, that's the way to end that. My God, hey.
So perhaps a little contra Cadell. I believe that the interiority of ourselves is so rich that that all that is required to experience the crash of self is to dream, is to imagine the life that you want to live, that you wished you were living, and then to experience that crashing. The proportion of pain, emotional pain, tends to be proportional to the height of the expectation and the depth of the fall from that expectation, the plane of reality. And in my experience, and so I'd like to think that this is a universalized conversation in that sense, where we all have this interiority of dreams and this failure to achieve them. And that tension in and of itself provides, I think, the reason to consider lack to the extent that one might be able to become a Buddha, that one might be able to experience the crash of the interior as incompatible with one's predicament. And I think I'll just be personal here for a second. I started doing some somatic therapy. When I was 3 years old, I was put in therapy. My father is a therapist, psychologist. He did something called psychodrama, sort of a predecessor to body work and somatic therapy. And I got in trouble for hitting kids when I was 3. And so I was put into therapy immediately. And then they found out my nanny was hitting me. Little imitation there, mimetic desire even. And so I'd been in and out of therapy for a long time, and then finally I decided to say, fuck that, and no longer look to anyone else to sort of fix me. But then I returned to somatic therapy, where the body itself is telling me my problems. And I'm searching the feelings of my body, which are very often, you know, when I experience the void, it's somatic. When I experience the void, it's somatic. In fact, it's usually placeable. It's in my throat or it's in my chest. It's a frenetic state. And for me, I experience the void negatively in the context of my goodness being questionable, which is usually a preponderance of experience out in the world, and people telling me I'm a piece of shit, telling me that I'm wrong, or me gleaning via various sort of inner subjectivities that I just am, that I fucked up, I'm not good enough, something's wrong. And that when I do meet the void will know too. And that I will be forced into a reckoning that I will be unprepared for. And that the void will strip me, denude me, and reveal to me my true self. Otherwise, what is the fear of the void? And one thing that I find very useful is actually adding nothing to that equation, where I add nothing to my throat. I add nothing to my chest. I add nothing to the space that is in disarray. And that state suddenly eternalizes. And suddenly I ingress the universe, and all of those considerations sort of disappear, and I essentially become a process. I become a process rather than a being, rather than a static entity. And I become the lack of a self that is static, the lack of a self that can be judged. I become it all. And of course, that's, you know, the sort of state we all want to achieve. And I just want to, on this notion of like how to convey, you know, wisdom, essentially. So we have this, I mentioned I was messing around with some equations earlier, and I'll just do the very simplest version. Minus x, so minus a thing that I'm lacking x, minus x plus x equals 0. It does not equal x. I do not get x by adding x to minus x. I get 0. So then, minus x plus x equals 0. If I substitute the first minus x with 0, I don't have to do the equation. I don't even have to do the work. And that's maybe magical thinking, but it's actually my experience. That if I add the lack, if I add nothing to the problem sort of unfurls. And I see myself as process. And then I can meet the lack because I am it. You know? And anyhow, yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, that formula resonates a lot. I think that formula actually can be used to describe a lot of experiences that I use to explain this process of coming to lack. Like, for example, and it's basically a formula that formula is exploited by advertising companies. You know, like you fill in the Nike shoe, and you know what I like. It just fill it, or you fill in the McDonald's hamburger or whatever, like that's, but it equals 0. You know, you get the Nike shoe, you get the McDonald's hamburger, and then you go home and you feel the 0. So I just think that's a precise formula. I'll also sort of here want to share a quote about how we find ourselves in this void, that we find ourselves in this void, even if it's a confrontation that's unpredicted, maybe even especially if it's unpredicted, you know, like just like getting, I always give the example of getting run over by a bus, like getting hit, or you go to the doctor's office and you get told, you know, you have terminal cancer, you know, like that's this unpredictable confrontation with the void. But here's a quote from Hegel. And before I give it, I just want to say that I'm getting some feedback audio. So if you guys could mute your... So the quote here, let me just give it. For this consciousness was not in peril and fear for this element or that, nor for this or that moment of time. It was afraid for its entire being. It felt the fear of death, the sovereign master. It has been in that experience melted to its inmost soul, has trembled throughout its every fiber, and all that was fixed and steadfast has quaked within it. This complete perturbation of its entire substance, this absolute dissolution of all its stability into fluent continuity, is, however, the simple, ultimate nature of self-consciousness, absolute negativity, pure self-relating existence, which consequently is involved in this type of consciousness, end quote. In other words, the confrontation with death or the void. Again, I think that quote is my favorite quote for like the experience of you go to the doctor's office and you have terminal cancer. This being totally destroyed, and that you find your truth in that moment. And I think that all I want to say is that whatever it is that we may explore in conversations about death practices, I would say that it has to channel connection with this almost as an embodied ritual to the point where one becomes comfortable with this. Another practice that I think sort of preparation for this that I found useful is staring into the mirror for extended periods of time and repeating to myself that what I'm looking at is not me. That's not you. I think it's really useful. So all I want to say here, I could maybe clarify one thing, which is on sort of like my notion that you have to sort of go on the process of like going for the goal, going for the dream, going for the goal before then you can reach the enlightened state, is like just saying that there seems to be a processual nature to the achievement of enlightenment in some sense. That's my only point with that. But maybe what we could do is give some sort of summary of how we feel about this conversation, how we feel about what we've achieved maybe in discussing the philosophy of lack. I will just sort of preface that roundtable, sort of like conclusion thinking about this statement by saying, I sort of started setting up this conversation by proposing that philosophy as a knowledge practice in the West grounds itself in an absolute being. That this notion of absolute being, narratively speaking, often we think of Parmenides. And even when we think about what absolute being might look like, we get this notion of like some spherical light or some being that's like everything and everywhere, omniscient, omnipresent, just everything. Just this being. And what I'm like almost trying to play with here is that when you think about this notion in its own historicity, in its own social historicity of like it's been thousands of years since Parmenides, we have the problem that the human subject has a great difficulty connecting with whatever this absolute being is, to the point where we need an entire discipline like psychoanalysis to treat subjects who come to us with these neuroses, even though we're in a heightened state of economic well-being. even though we're in a heightened state of wealth, that no matter how much wealth and material or being we accumulate, people feel something's missing, that there's something lacking. And I think that a wise culture we need practices to help people deal with this kind of objective lack that people feel. And the formula that I think Alex proposed, that I think companies utilize, like, again, the Nike shoe or the McDonald's hamburger, to fill your lack, that only makes you feel more lack in a bad sense, is something that we need to confront. And I think that the stakes are extremely high, because, like, when you think about the conflict in the 20th century with capitalism, we have communism, but communism didn't have a good understanding of the human being. Like, it was a naive understanding of the human being. Communism didn't have a total theory of human development, how to commune with each other, how to romantically engage with each other, how to engage with the full development of a human being in the context of community. These are deep, deep, deep questions, and they require extremely wise practice. So that's where I would sort of pass it on, and my sort of final thoughts, I suppose.
Well, that was excellent, Cadell. No, it's you can't get anywhere if you don't know where you are, can you? So if we have the wrong understanding of what human beings are, we're not going to be able to get anywhere. We can come up with a lot of destinations, but they may not be good, and we may not get anywhere. Now I have this idea. Now I want to, like, Homo erectus, I want to do like Homo lacus or something, and try to understand why we have this ontology. I love the idea. Maybe dreams are part of it. Maybe it's because our brains want stability in an unstable world. I mean, Christians will say, you're made in God and you want to return to God. It's very interesting. Lacus is probably not a word, but it sounds Latin-y, and I wanted to do it. And to your point, I think it is incredibly important that we engage in this conversation and ideas, because we were talking about Camus earlier. I am yet to meet someone who has finished reading Camus, and now they are a Sisyphus who can smile. I have not met anyone who has gone through the existential text and afterwards you're like, yep, I can push a boulder and I can smile, baby. No, there's something missing. There's something incomplete. I'm not saying there's no use to it. And also it's interesting because a lot of, you talk about meditation, OSHA, different things. These practices have a role, but it's moving between them. And maybe we've lacked a understanding of what humans are to know that we need to move between them. Maybe we've lacked an understanding of the role of these transitions where we say, okay, yes, we need to economically provide for everybody. But then when we get there, we also have to be ready to deal with the mental health issues that may develop. There may be all these kind of misunderstandings of which are captured by some sort of narrative of stability. Once we get the right economic system, then everything's good. Once we get the right A is A, then everything will be good. That has contributed to the problem. And these conversations need to occur because it does not seem as if the understanding of the problem is adequate. And therefore, as a result, we are yet to, like I said, I've never met anyone who has finished reading Camus and now there are Sisyphus who can smile while pushing a boulder. So I think it's important. And the last thing I was going to say is I think is this interesting idea that the topic of lacks seem to be incredibly practical. Why is that? Well, maybe it's something where ideas relative to themselves, they don't contradict. The world, when I look at my laptop, the laptop stays the laptop. It doesn't contradict, but the lack becomes in the between space of those things, of the idea with the world, that then makes it to where when you end up talking about lack, you're always talking in a experience of. And so that's another reason why it might be useful, and I could elaborate on that, but useful is that it's a very phenomenological and practical philosophy. And this also will suggest, I think Camus is interesting because as you read his canon, you go through his work, I feel like a realization that his prescription for how to be a smiling Sisyphus does not quite work. And I wish he wouldn't have died in that car crash. It would have been very interesting to see how his thought develops. It may have ended up in a philosophy of lacks. And I think the very fact also suggests the role of the great literature in this conversation, but I will save that for next time. And I caught you right when you were drinking, Tim, didn't I? My timing was perfect, wasn't it?
My timing, that was bad. Like I knew you were about to finish. I was just like, fuck it. Man, so good. Like I have so much appreciation for all of you. Really enjoyed being here. So it's one of those ones where I feel like I am reluctant to really open up and say too much. So maybe paradoxically, then I might just leave with another, moving towards a question for next dialogues. And I'll begin by remembering Alexander Bard said to me in a podcast, in talking about sort of spiritual practice in particular, but I think this can be applied to lots of other things, the triple of intention, ceremony, and integration. And if we think about the context of sport, if I'm thinking about playing football, I'm thinking, all right, practicing the game and reflecting on it and recovery or something like this. When we're speaking about wisdom practices, and again, it gets to this relationship, well, I haven't presenced it, but the relationship again, with, as a nod to Bard, is between process and event. There's something about practicing without a directionality toward, let's say, an event or a certain form of contribution, which feels lacking in an incoherent sense. And so as we sort of find ourselves in what does seem like to me a coming together of a number of people, nascent communities, this merging and generative interaction, we hope, between a bunch of different traditions and philosophies, still very much on the edges. But as there is this, seems to be like the cultivation of new possibility, I do continue to be interested in the sorts of events for which our practice requires, in some sense, for its coherence to matter. Now we can say, okay, it's always available in relationship, and that's true. And that's the thing about speaking like process event. To me, it seems to be always process and event, always. And nevertheless, I guess at more of the level of influence, which is something that might be worth nodding to, given this is not just a conversation between the four of us, that it's being streamed. And this is something quite close to something of a discourse that I'm working in, I suppose, is trying to understand and sort of a way to be in a kind of ethical relationship with the transformation of the communications commons, and the dynamics of influence and audience and production and consumption, which again threaten and are very much apparent in what seems to be holding together the psychologies of so much of plays a role in holding together the psychologies of the members of our culture. Netflix, various ways to access hypernormal stimuli that paper over the cracks. So the nod towards next time, along with so much else that you all have raised, is to consider. For me, it's always to consider what does a more ultimately inclusive way of performing look like, bringing practice into community. This, like, what is it to commune? But in the age of the digital, I think these are just really, really interesting questions to always, like, the relationship between inclusion and coherence is so fascinating. I'm not talking naively about inclusion. Hey, definitely not. but I'm also, there's something, and I don't believe really anyone's claiming this, certainly not here or otherwise, but there are notions of ecologies of practices, and there's the importance of doing kind of self-work. But my God, you know, and lockdown shows me very much this. It's like important to have practices to call on when I'm stuck in a tiny apartment for like more than half the year. But I don't just want to be practicing so I can stay in a tiny apartment for the rest of my life. Something like this. So a nod towards the future of building, again, is a hazardous but critical question. And I'm not proposing it as a naive one. There's so many traps of centralization and totalizing narratives and all the things we've presenced. But nevertheless, I hope as a distributed collective that includes more than the four of us here, if we don't venture coherently toward experimenting with the process of answering, and it's not, I don't know the right language, it's the process, it's the dialectic, not about final solutions, but man, something like that, how to relate to that, what can that look like? These are questions I'll be asking. So thank you so much, guys. It's been such a privilege here.
Yeah, this is really fun. And thanks for Tim pointing out that this conversation is part of a larger conversation that's happening. I'm really fucking happy to be a part of that conversation. It satisfies one of my lacks. It satisfies one of my desires. And it feels good. And there's something about becoming that is fucking great. And so while we develop this philosophy of lack, I'm also appreciating what the lack projects me towards. And I think in some sense, this is where ethics comes in, a sense of sort of pre-thought, proportional thinking. We've looked around. When I say proportional thinking, I'm trying to add a fifth P to Vervaeke's 4 Ps. A P that intrinsically imbibes us with a sense of proportionality, which then translates to ethics. So I can see where the asymmetry is. So I can see where the holes in the tapestry and the quilt of society are. So I can be of service wherever those holes may be. And I feel like this is part of that proportional understanding for me. And that's sort of a pre-thought, pre-language experience, almost entirely semiotic. I think there's a lot, you know, the event and process, which I love, and I also, in my own words, and in the context of this, in some sense, I think it's helpful to also provide optional language which is ritual and tradition. The ritual, and then the tradition, the repetition of it, and the degradation of it, and then the eventual ritual again. To me, ritual I've come to recently understand as a creative process inspired by nothing, inspired by the ingressing of the universe, inspired by inspiration as opposed to contention and all the contents I've built up and, oh, I know how to do this, procedural knowledge, but rather this intention. And intentio in Latin is reaching out, breaking the membrane of the self, breaking it open so that it can ingress, so that nothing can ingress, so that I don't know can ingress. And then just to add a couple thoughts here. This is going to seem sort of ridiculous and obvious at the same time, but I'm sure we've all noticed that the more stuff people accumulate, the richer they become, the more stuffed up their fucking neighborhoods are. The less noise you can make, the less fun it is, the less you can trespass. I have innumerable stories to provide in case any one of you don't for yourself. The accumulation of content of certainty, of self, that compactment requires a stronger membrane to protect it. The more stuff we have, the more of ourselves we think we're certain of, the stronger the membrane must be to keep those contents in, the less we are able to access the nothing, the universe, the stuff, the substance. And so it is, I think, that the less, that lack is like true lack, the sense of like, oh, I'm lacking, is a lack of nothing. And I just want to keep fucking reminding myself of that. Lack, the feeling of lack is actually a lack of nothing. I don't have enough nothing. And that is my fucking, I need to remember, I need to like paint that on my forehead. That is the shit. And that is the creative state. It yields everything that I fucking care about. And so I'm really happy to be having this conversation. It's super helpful, and you know, keep talking about it.
All right, guys. That was great. I'm really really grateful for all of you as well. I just want to summarize for either the people viewing live or the people viewing after the fact that this was a conversation between four humans that are just inquiring about lack on an existential level, and trying to think a philosophy of lack on the basis that paradoxically we're missing a philosophy about the fact that we're lacking, that there's often the pretense or the performativity that we know, or there's a pretense or a performativity that we have the thing. And I hope that we were able to do this opening topic, opening conversation on lack, some justice in that, and with some humility. So on that note, I'm gonna close up, and until next time.
Absolutely, looking forward to it.
Yeah, great.
You guys are awesome. That was wonderful. Thank y'all.
All right, peace out, guys.
Peace.